Keep moving, or we're both dead by dawn." Thorne's voice cut through the biting wind, low and urgent, as he pulled Ayanna deeper into the labyrinth of jagged cliffs. The words weren't just a warning, they were a promise, carved from the blood-soaked floor of his cabin and the bodies he'd left behind. The mountains loomed around them, their peaks clawing at a sky bruised purple by the fading day. Somewhere behind, the hoof beats of bounty hunters echoed like a death knell, faint but growing louder. Thorne's hand tightened on Ayanna's arm, steadying her as she stumbled over loose shale, her breath hitching from the pain of her still-bleeding wound. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and frost, and the narrow canyon path twisted like a serpent's spine, offering no mercy to the wounded or the hunted. Ayanna's buckskin dress, torn and crusted with blood, snagged on a thorn bush, and she stifled a gasp. Thorne's eyes flicked to her, catching the flicker of defiance in her dark gaze despite the exhaustion pulling at her frame. She was no ordinary fugitive, this daughter of Chief Nalish, and he was no ordinary savior. 12 years of solitude had forged Thorne Shepherd into a ghost, a man who'd buried his past in these mountains. But now, with her life tethered to his, that ghost was forced to run, to fight, to feel again. They'd fled his cabin hours ago, leaving behind the only sanctuary he'd known since the world had chewed him up and spat him out. The bounty hunter's 3 dead men had been only the beginning. Ayanna's warning rang in his ears. They'll send more. And they would. Men like Deputy Marshal Clayton Briggs didn't vanish without consequence. The territorial government, hungry for control over Apache lands, would see their deaths as a challenge, a spark to ignite a manhunt that would scour these mountains until blood paid for blood. Thorne's boots crunched against the rocky ground as he scanned the terrain ahead. The canyon narrowed into a bottleneck, a natural choke point where a single rifleman could pin them down. His mind, sharpened by years of survival, raced through options. Keep moving, double back, or find a hideout. Every choice carried a price. Ayanna's labored breathing beside him was a constant reminder that time was not their ally. Her wound, though bandaged with strips of his old shirt, still wept blood, staining the cloth a dark, accusing red. She needed rest, medicine, Timononi of which they had. Up there, Ayanna whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. She pointed with a trembling hand toward a shadowed crevice in the canyon wall, half hidden by a cascade of vines and loose rock. A cave. My people used it to hide from soldiers. Thorne's eyes narrowed, assessing the distance. 50 yards, maybe less, but the open ground between them and the crevice was a death trap. No cover, no shadows, just a stretch of pale stone under a merciless sky. The hoof beats were closer now, accompanied by the faint jingle of spurs and the low murmur of voices. At least 5 riders, maybe more. Bounty hunters didn't travel in small packs when they smelled a prize like Ayanna, daughter of a war chief, worth more alive than dead, but only just. He met her gaze, searching for hesitation, for fear. There was none. Her dark eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence he'd seen when she first woke on his bed, as if she could see through his scars to the man he'd been before the mountains claimed him. "Can you make it?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "I've made it this far," she said, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips despite the pain. "Don't slow down for me, Ghost Captain." The name hit him like a bullet. Ghost Captain, a title from a life he'd tried to bury, whispered in saloons and barracks, a legend built on vengeance and blood. He'd been Captain Thorne Shepherd, 5th Cavalry, a man who'd hunted corrupt officers with a relentless fury after they betrayed his unit. Now, that past was clawing its way back, awakened by the woman beside him and the men who hunted her. "Stay low," he said, dropping to a crouch and pulling her with him. They moved as one, their steps synchronized despite the uneven ground. The crevice was closer now, its dark mouth promising shelter, but also danger. Caves could be traps as easily as havens. If the bounty hunters saw them enter, they'd be cornered like rats. But the alternativacing a posse in open ground was suicide. The wind carried a shout, sharp and commanding. "Spread out. They can't have gone far." The voice was new, not Briggs's, but it carried the same arrogance, the same hunger for blood money. Thorne's jaw tightened. He recognized the typemen who wore badges, but hunted for profit, who'd sell their own kin for $1. He'd killed their kind before, and he'd do it again if it meant keeping Ayanna alive. They reached the crevice just as the first rider crested the ridge behind them. Thorne shoved Ayanna through the narrow opening, ignoring her sharp intake of breath as the movement jarred her wound. He followed, squeezing his broad shoulders through the jagged gap, his rifle catching briefly on the rock. Inside, the air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of moss and earth. The cave stretched deeper than he'd expected, its walls glistening with moisture, its floor sloping downward into darkness. "Keep going," he whispered, guiding her forward with a hand on her shoulder. The faint light from the entrance barely penetrated the gloom, but Ayanna moved with purpose, as if she'd walked these paths before. Her people's knowledge of these mountains was their greatest weapon, and Thorne was beginning to understand why the Apache had never been fully subdued. The cave widened into a chamber, its ceiling studded with stalactites that gleamed like teeth in the dim light. Ayanna sank to her knees, her strength finally giving out. Thorne caught her before she hit the ground, easing her against the cold stone wall. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy under his touch. "Stay with me," he said, his voice rough with a fear he hadn't felt in years. Not for himself, but for her. "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured, her eyes half closed but still sharp. "Not yet." He tore a fresh strip from his shirt and pressed it against her wound, cursing under his breath. The bleeding had slowed, but not enough. He needed needle, thread, proper bandages, things he didn't have. The cave offered safety for now, but it was a temporary reprieve. The bounty hunters would find the crevice eventually, and when they did, there'd be no running. Outside, the voices grew louder, closer. Thorne crept to the entrance, peering through the vines. 6 riders now, dismounted, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. They moved with the precision of men who'd hunted humans before, fanning out to cover the canyon floor. One knelt, examining the ground where Ayanna's blood had dripped. Another pointed toward the crevice, his voice carrying just enough for Thorne to catch the words, "Trail ends here." Thorne's grip tightened on his rifle. 6 against 1, with Ayanna too weak to fight. The odds were worse than in the cabin, but he'd faced worse before. The ghost captain had earned his name in blood, and these men were about to learn why. He returned to Ayanna, his mind already mapping the cave's layout, searching for advantages. "How deep does this go?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Deep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a tunnel leads to a spring. My people used it to escape raids. But it's narrow. Dangerous. Dangerous is better than dead," he said, helping her to her feet. She leaned heavily against him, her warmth a stark contrast to the cold stone around them. The tunnel was their only chance, but it meant leaving the rifle behind too bulky for tight spaces. He slung it over his shoulder anyway, unwilling to abandon it until he had no choice. The tunnel was a jagged scar in the rock, barely wide enough for Thorne's shoulders. He went first, holding Ayanna's hand to guide her through the darkness. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against them like a living thing. The sound of their pursuers faded, replaced by the drip of water and the faint echo of their own footsteps. Thorne's senses strained, alert for any sign of collapse or ambush. He'd heard stories of Apache hideouts rigged with traps, falling rocks, hidden pits. If Ayanna's people had used this cave, it was possible they'd left defenses behind. "Stop," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice sharp despite her weakness. She pressed a hand against the wall, her fingers tracing a faint carving in the stony spiral intersected by a single line. "This is a warning. The tunnel splits ahead. One path leads to the spring, the other to a drop." Thorne's stomach tightened. "You know which is which." She hesitated, her breath hitching. "I was a child the last time I came here. The elders taught us the signs," but she shook her head, frustration etching her features. "The carvings are old, worn." He studied the spiral, its edges smoothed by time and water. A wrong choice meant death, either by falling or by being cornered when the bounty hunters caught up. He glanced at Ayanna, her face pale but resolute. She was trusting him to lead, just as he was trusting her knowledge to survive. For the first time in 12 years, he wasn't alone in a fight, and the weight of that realization was both a burden and a strange kind of relief. "Left or right?" he asked, his voice steady despite the stakes. Ayanna closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as if reciting a long-forgotten lesson. "Left," she said finally. "The spiral points left." He nodded, trusting her instinct over his own. They moved forward, the tunnel narrowing until Thorne had to turn sideways, his shoulders scraping against the rock. Ayana's breathing grew more labored, her steps faltering. He slowed, letting her lean against him, her weight a reminder of how fragile this alliance was. She was no damsel, no helpless victim, but she was human, and humans broke under enough pressure. The tunnel opened suddenly into a small chamber, the air sharp with the scent of water. A spring bubbled in the center, its surface catching the faint light that filtered through a crack in the ceiling. Thorne knelt beside it, filling his canteen and offering it to Ayana. She drank deeply, her hands trembling as she wiped her mouth. "We can't stay long," he said, scanning the chamber. 3 exits branched off, each a dark maw leading deeper into the mountain. "Which one?" Ayana pointed to the middle tunnel, her finger steady despite her exhaustion. "That one. It leads to the other side of the ridge. We can lose them there." Thorne helped her stand, his arm around her waist to support her weight. The intimacy of the gesture struck him. How long had it been since he'd touched another person with anything but violence? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the path ahead. The tunnel was wider here, allowing them to move side by side, but the air grew colder, the walls slick with moisture. The faint sound of water grew louder, a steady rush that suggested a river or waterfall nearby. They'd gone maybe 100 yards when a new sound stopped them, cold, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the tunnel itself. Thorne froze, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. The rifle was useless in these tight quarters, and his pistol had only 4 rounds left. Ayana's eyes widened, her body tensing against his. "Bear," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rush of water. "Not a bear," she said, her voice tight. "Something worse." Before he could ask what she meant, a shadow moved in the darkness ahead. Not the hulking shape of an animal, but something human, or nearly so. A figure stepped into the faint light, its silhouette tall and angular, cloaked in tattered rags that hung like strips of flesh. Its face was obscured, but the ice glinting like polished obsidian locked onto them with an intensity that made Thorne's blood run cold. "Who are you?" Thorne demanded, stepping in front of Ayana, his knife drawn. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, revealing a blade that gleamed with an unnatural sheen, as if it drank the light rather than reflected it. The air grew heavier, the temperature plummeting as if the cave itself recoiled from the figure's presence. Ayana's hand tightened on Thorne's arm, her voice a whisper. "He's not one of them. He's something else." Thorne's mind raced. He'd heard stories in saloons, tales whispered by prospectors and trappers about things that haunted these mountain spirits. Outcasts, men driven mad by isolation or worse. He'd dismissed them as drunken nonsense, but the figure before them was no hallucination. It moved with purpose, its blade tracing slow, deliberate arcs in the air, as if testing their resolve. "Stay behind me," Thorne said, his voice low but firm. He didn't know what this thing was, but he'd faced death too many times to back down now. The figure lunged, its movements unnaturally fast, the blade slicing through the air toward Thorne's chest. He parried with his knife, the impact jarring his arm, but he held his ground, pushing back with a strength born of desperation. The fight was brutal, confined by the narrow tunnel. Thorne's blade found the figure's arm, drawing a hiss that was more animal than human. The figure retaliated, its weapon grazing Thorne's shoulder, leaving a burning line of pain. Ayana, despite her wound, grabbed a loose rock and hurled it, striking the figure's head. It staggered, giving Thorne an opening to drive his knife into its side. The figure collapsed, but no blood flowed. Instead, a faint shimmer, like heat rising from desert sand, emanated from the wound. The body dissolved into shadow, leaving only the blade behind, its metal cold and unnaturally heavy in Thorne's hand. He stared at it, his heart pounding, the air still thick with the sense of something wrong, something ancient. "What was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ayana's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had vanished. The elders spoke of guardian spirits, bound to these mountains to protect sacred places, or to curse them. Thorne's jaw tightened. Guardians don't bleed. That thing was real. Real or not, it wasn't alone, she said, pointing to the tunnel ahead. Faint whispers, like wind through dry leaves, echoed from the darkness. More figures, more blades, more eyes glinting in the gloom. Thorne's hand closed around the strange blade, its weight grounding him even as his mind screamed that this was no ordinary fight. The bounty hunters were closing in from behind, their voices now audible through the cave's entrance. Ahead, the whispers grew louder, the shadows shifting as if alive. Thorne and Ayanna were trapped between two dangers, one human, one not. The ghost captain had faced armies, outlaws, and his own demons, but this was something new, something that challenged the very rules of the world he'd known. He looked at Ayanna, her face set with the same stubborn pride that had drawn him to her from the moment she'd collapsed in his arms. "We fight, or we run," he said. "Your call." Her eyes met his, fierce and unbroken despite the pain, the fear, the impossible odds. "We fight," she said. "Together." Thorne nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. For 12 years, he'd run from everything his past, his pain, himself. But now, with Ayanna at his side, he felt something he hadn't in over a decade: purpose. Whatever lay ahead, bounty hunters, spirits, or the mountains themselves, they'd face it together. And God help anything that stood in their way. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in. Thorne raised the strange blade, its edge catching the faint light like a promise of violence. Behind them, the bounty hunters' footsteps echoed, their shouts growing clearer. The cave seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the mountain itself was watching, waiting to see what the ghost captain and the Apache princess would do next. "You ever wonder if the mountains themselves want you dead?" Ayanna's whispered question hung in the damp air of the cave, her voice barely audible over the growing chorus of whispers from the shadows ahead. Thorne didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the glinting blade in his hand, the one he'd taken from the fallen guardian. Its unnatural weight a constant reminder of the strangeness they'd stumbled into. The cave pulsed around them, its walls slick with moisture that seemed to sweat under the pressure of unseen eyes. Behind, the bounty hunters' shouts echoed closer, their boots scraping against stone as they breached the crevice. Ahead, the shadows writhed, their whispers sharpening into something almost human, almost words, but laced with a malice that made Thorne's skin crawl. He glanced at Ayanna, her face pale in the faint light filtering through the cave's ceiling cracks. Her wound, though bandaged, was a dark stain against her buckskin dress, and her breathing came in short, determined gasps. She was weaker than she let on, but her eyes burned with a fire that refused to gut her out. That fire had kept her alive through an ambush, through miles of hostile terrain, through collapsing into a stranger's arms. Now, it was all that stood between them and whatever waited in the darkness. "Mountains don't care enough to want anything," Thorne said finally, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "But they'll kill you all the same if you give them the chance." Ayanna's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to cut through the tension. Spoken like a man who's fought them before. Fought and lost, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. 12 years in these mountains had taught him their cruel avalanches, that buried men without warning, rivers that swallowed horses whole, winters that stripped flesh from bone. But this cave, with its whispering shadows and vanished guardians, was something else entirely. Something older, angrier, as if the earth itself resented their intrusion. The bounty hunters' voices grew clearer now, their words carrying through the tunnel like poison on the wind. "Blood trails fresh. They're in here somewhere." The speaker was new, not the cruel drawl of Deputy Marshal Briggs, but just as hungry, just as relentless. Thorne counted at least 6 sets of boots, maybe more, their spurs jangling like the chains of condemned men. He tightened his grip on the strange blade, its cold metal grounding him against the rising tide of dread. "We need to move," he said, helping Ayanna to her feet. She swayed briefly, her hand clutching his arm for support, but she nodded, her jaw set with the same stubborn pride he'd come to recognize. The middle tunnel, the one she'd chosen, stretched ahead, its mouth wide but treacherous. The rush of water louder now, promising an underground river or worse. The other 2 exits loomed like silent threats, their darkness hiding unknown dangers. Ayanna's warning about the tunnel's split lingered in his mind, One path to freedom, one to a fatal drop. They'd chosen left at the spiral carving. But the Guardian's attack had shaken his trust in their path. What else had the elders not told her? The whispers from the shadows grew sharper, forming syllables that teased at meaning, but never quite resolved. Leave take blood. Thorne's pulse quickened, his instinct screaming that they were being watched, judged, hunted. He pulled Ayanna closer, her warmth a fleeting anchor against the cold malice of the cave. Stay close, he whispered. Whatever's out there, we face it together. She nodded, her fingers tightening briefly on his arm, a silent agreement that bound them more than words could. They moved forward, the tunnel narrowing until the walls brushed their shoulders, the air thick with the scent of wet stone and something sharper, metallic, like blood or iron. The strange blade in Thorne's hand seemed to hum faintly, a vibration so subtle he might have imagined it. But Ayanna's glance at the weapon told him she felt it too. The tunnel opened into another chamber, larger than the last, its ceiling lost in shadow. The rush of water was deafening now, coming from a jagged fissure in the far wall where an underground river churned, its surface black and restless. A narrow ledge ran alongside it, barely wide enough for one person, leading to a faint glow in the distanceth promise of an exit or a trap. The chamber's walls were etched with carvings, spirals and lines like the one Ayanna had recognized. But these were deeper, more intricate, as if carved with desperate urgency. Some were stained dark, as if blood had seeped into the stone over centuries. These are older than my people, Ayanna said, her voice hushed with awe. The elders spoke of places like this sacred, cursed, places where the earth remembers. Remembers what? Thorne asked, his eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The whispers were louder here, circling them like vultures, and the air felt charged, as if a storm brewed within the stone itself. Everything, she said. Joy, pain, betrayal. The mountains don't forget. Before he could press her further, a new sound cut through the whispers, a low, guttural chant, rising and falling like a heartbeat. It came from the shadows near the river, where the carvings were densest. Thorne's hand tightened on the blade, his body shifting instinctively to shield Ayanna. The chant grew louder, the words unintelligible but heavy with intent, and the shadows began to move again. Not one figure this time, but three, their forms flickering like flames in a windstorm. Their eyes glinted, obsidian bright, and their bladis identical to the one Thorne held caught the dim light with an unnatural sheen. Guardians, Ayanna breathed, her voice trembling not with fear but with recognition. They protect the heart of the mountain, or they curse it. Thorne didn't care what they were. Spirit, man, or something in between. They were a threat, and he'd learned long ago that threats were met with steel. Stay back, he told Ayanna, stepping forward, the strange blade raised. The Guardians moved as one, their movements fluid and synchronized like predators circling prey. Their blades sang through the air, a high, keening sound that set Thorne's teeth on edge. The first Guardian lunged, its blade aiming for his throat. Thorne parried, the impact sending a jolt through his arm, the strange metal of their weapons clashing with a sound like shattering glass. The second Guardian flanked him, its blade slicing toward his ribs, but Thorne twisted, catching the attack on his own weapon and driving his elbow into the figure's chest. It staggered but didn't fall, its form shimmering as if it might dissolve like the first. The third Guardian went for Ayanna, who stood her ground despite her wound, a rock in her hand ready to strike. Thorne roared, a sound born of rage and desperation, and threw himself at the third Guardian, tackling it to the ground. The impact jarred his wounded shoulder, but he ignored the pain, driving his blade into the figure's side. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a kettle, and dissolved into shadow, leaving only its blade behind. The other two Guardians retreated, their forms flickering as if uncertain, their chant faltering. Thorne, Ayanna's cry snapped his attention back. She was pointing to the river, where the water churned violently, as if something massive moved beneath its surface. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their lines pulsing in time with the chant, which resumed louder now, angrier. The remaining Guardians didn't attack again, but stood at the edge of the chamber, their eyes fixed on the river, as if waiting for something to emerge. We need to go, Thorne said, pulling Ayanna toward the ledge. Now. She nodded, her face pale but resolute, and they edged along the narrow path, the river roaring beside them. The ledge was slick, the stone worn smooth by centuries of water, and every step felt like a gamble with death. Thorne kept one hand on Ayanna's arm, the other gripping the strange blade, its hum growing stronger as they neared the glow at the tunnel's end. The bounty hunters' voices were fainter now, muffled by the roar of the river, but Thorne knew they were still coming. Men like that didn't give up, not when there was blood money to be had. The ledge ended at a wide platform, the glow revealing a massive cavern, its ceiling studded with crystalline formations that caught the light like stars. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface carved with the same spirals and lines, but these were inlaid with a metal that gleamed like liquid silver. Atop the altar lay a single object, a small, obsidian sphere, no larger than a fist, pulsing faintly with an inner light. The air around it crackled, heavy with the same energy Thorne had felt from the Guardian's blades. Ayanna froze, her eyes locked on the sphere. "The heart of the mountain," she whispered. "The elders spoke of it, a relic of the old ones, before my people came to these lands. It holds the memory of the earth." Thorne didn't like the sound of that. Relics meant power, and power meant trouble. "We don't have time for legends," he said, glancing back at the tunnel. The bounty hunters' voices were growing louder again, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Can we get past it?" Ayanna shook her head, her expression torn between awe and fear. "It's not just a relic. It's alive. The Guardians protect it. If we touch it, they'll come for us." "They're already coming," Thorne said, his voice sharp. "And so are the hunters. We move, or we die." She nodded, swallowing hard, and they skirted the altar, keeping as much distance as possible. The sphere's light pulsed faster, the air growing heavier. The whispers now a deafening cacophony of voices, some pleading, some raging, some weeping. Thorne's head throbbed, his vision blurring as memories he'd buried for 12 years clawed their way to the surface. His unit's screams as they were ambushed, the faces of the men he'd hunted in revenge, the endless nights staring into the dark, alone with his guilt. Ayanna stumbled, her hand clutching his arm as if anchoring herself against the same onslaught. "It knows us," she gasped. "It sees what we've lost." Thorne gritted his teeth, forcing the memories down. "It's just a rock," he growled, though he didn't believe it. He pulled her forward, toward the tunnel beyond the altar, its mouth promising freedom but heavy with the weight of whatever lay ahead. The Guardians hadn't followed, but their chant echoed through the cavern, a warning that they weren't done. The tunnel sloped upward, the air growing fresher, the glow of daylight faintly visible. Thorne's heart lifted. Escape was close, but the sound of boots behind them shattered the hope. The bounty hunters had reached the chamber, their shouts of triumph echoing as they spotted the altar. "There, that's got to be worth a fortune," one yelled, his greed palpable even from a distance. Thorne pushed Ayanna forward, his mind racing. The hunters would be distracted by the sphere, but not for long. If they touched it, the Guardians might attack, buying Thorne and Ayanna time, but at what cost? The cave itself seemed to pulse with anger, the carvings glowing brighter, the whispers now a scream. Whatever the heart of the mountain was, it didn't want to be taken. The tunnel opened onto a narrow ledge overlooking a steep valley, the night sky stretching above like a velvet shroud. The air was crisp, the stars sharp, but there was no time to savor the freedom. Thorne scanned the terrain, a rocky descent to a river below, dense forest on the far bank, mountains stretching endlessly beyond. They could lose the hunters in the trees, but Ayanna's strength was fading fast, her steps faltering as blood seeped through her bandage. "We need to rest," he said, guiding her to a cluster of boulders that offered some cover. She sank down, her breathing ragged, her eyes still fixed on the tunnel behind them. "They'll come," she said. "The heart, it won't let them leave." Thorne didn't argue. He'd seen too much in that cave to dismiss her words. Instead, he checked her wound, his hands steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. The gash was deeper than he'd realized, the edges ragged from her movement. "You need a doctor," he said, his voice tight, "or you won't make it through the night." "There's a healer," she said, her voice weak but clear. "In the high valley, beyond the river. My people, some survived the raid. They'll be there." Thorne's jaw tightened. The high valley was Apache territory, a place no white man entered and lived to tell about it. But Ayanna wasn't just any Apache, was Nalish's daughter, and her people were her only chance. How far? He asked. 2 days, she said. If we don't stop. He didn't need to ask what would happen if they did. The bounty hunters, the guardians, the mountain itself, everything was conspiring to kill them. He tore another strip from his shirt, reinforcing her bandage, and handed her the canteen. Drink. Then we move. She obeyed, her eyes never leaving his face. Why are you doing this, Thorne? You could have left me in that cave. You could still leave me now. He didn't answer right away, his hands busy with the bandage, his mind grappling with the question. Why was he doing this? He'd spent 12 years building a life where no one could hurt him, where no one could matter. But Ayanna had shattered that life with a single knock on his door, her blood and defiance pulling him back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. Because you remind me of someone, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone I couldn't save. Her eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. But before she could respond, a scream echoed from the tunnel, a sound of pure terror, cut short by a wet, choking gurgle. The guardians, or something worse, had found the bounty hunters. Thorne pulled Ayanna to her feet, his arm around her waist as they stumbled down the rocky descent, the river's roar growing louder below. The valley was a maze of shadows and stone, the forest a dark promise of cover, but also danger. Thorne's senses strained, alert for pursuit, for the guardians, for anything that might emerge from the night. Ayanna's weight grew heavier against him, her steps slower, but she didn't complain, didn't falter. Her strength, even now, was a fire that burned through the pain, and Thorne drew on it, letting it fuel his own resolve. They reached the river just as the moon rose, its light silvering the water's surface. The current was swift, too strong to ford here, but a fallen log spanned the gap, its surface slick with moss. Thorne tested it with his weight, the wood creaking but holding. Can you cross? He asked, his eyes searching hers for any sign of surrender. I can try, she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etching her features. She took a step onto the log, her hand gripping his for balance, and they began the slow, perilous crossing. The river roared below, its spray cold against their skin, the log trembling under their weight. Halfway across, Ayanna's foot slipped, and she would have fallen if Thorne hadn't caught her, his arm locking around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Her breath hitched, not from pain, but from the sudden closeness, their faces inches apart. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them, the river's roar fading, the danger behind and ahead forgotten. Thorne's heart pounded, not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years, something dangerous, something human. Don't let go, she whispered, her voice soft but fierce. Never, he said, and meant it. They crossed the log, reaching the far bank just as shouts echoed from the valley above. The bounty hunters, or what was left of them, had survived the cave. Thorne pulled Ayanna into the forest, the trees closing around them like a shield, their branches swallowing the moonlight. But as they moved deeper, the whispers returned, faint but persistent, following them like ghosts. The heart of the mountain wasn't done with them. Neither were the men who hunted for blood money. And as Thorne and Ayanna pushed deeper into the wilderness, the bond between them grew stronger, forged in blood, danger, and a shared defiance against a world that wanted them dead. The high valley was still a day away, and the night was full of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Some ghosts don't die, they just wait for you to catch up. Thorne's words were a low growl, barely audible over the rustle of pine needles underfoot as he and Ayanna pushed deeper into the forest. The moon hung high, its silver light fractured by the canopy, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The river's roar had faded behind them, but the whispers from the Cavith ones that had followed them like a curse lingered, faint but relentless, weaving through the trees like a predator stalking its prey. Ayanna's weight leaned heavier against Thorne now, her steps faltering as blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on her ribs. Her defiance burned bright, but her body was betraying her, each breath a battle against the pain that threatened to drag her under. The high valley, where Ayanna's people waited with their healer, was still a day's trek through unforgiving terrain. The forest offered cover, but it was a double-edged blade. Every shadow could hide a bounty hunter. Every snap of a twig could signal death. Thorne's senses were stretched taut, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement, his ears straining for the telltale jingle of spurs or the low chant of the guardians. The strange blade, taken from the fallen guardian in the cave, hung heavy at his belt, its faint hum a constant reminder of the mountain's wrath. He didn't know what the heart of the mountain was, but he felt its presence, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Ayanna stumbled, her hand clutching his arm to steady herself. Thorne stopped, easing her against a moss-covered boulder, his hands quick but gentle as he checked her wound. The cloth was soaked through, the blood dark and sticky in the moonlight. "You're losing too much," he said, his voice tight with a fear he couldn't hide. "We need to stop the bleeding, or you won't make it to the valley." Her dark eyes met his, sharp despite the exhaustion etching her face. "I've survived worse," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. She was Nalish's daughter, forged in the fire of Apache resilience. But even steel could break under enough pressure. Thorne tore another strip from his already tattered shirt, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd patch wounds on battlefields. "Worse doesn't mean invincible," he said, pressing the fresh cloth against her side. She winced but didn't pull away, her gaze holding his with an intensity that made his chest ache. 12 years of solitude had taught him to bury his emotions, to live as a ghost among the living. But Ayanna's presence was unraveling that armor, piece by piece. She saw him not the ghost captain, not the hermit, but the man beneath, scarred and haunted but still breathing. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "They're close. I can feel them." Thorne nodded, his ears catching the distant crack of a branch. The faint murmur of voices carried on the wind. The bounty hunters had survived the cave, or some of them had. The screams they'd heard as they fled suggested the guardians had taken a toll. But men driven by greed were harder to kill than most. He helped Ayanna to her feet, her arms slung over his shoulder, and they moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing around them like a fortress of shadow and wood. The whispers grew louder now, no longer confined to the cave. They wove through the pines, a chorus of voices, some pleading, some accusing, some weeping for losses older than the mountains themselves. Thorne's skin prickled, his grip tightening on the strange blade. He'd faced death in 100 forms, bullets, blades, betrayal, but this was different. The heart of the mountain wasn't just a relic, it was a force, alive and vengeful, and it had marked them both the moment they'd entered its domain. "Do you hear them?" Ayanna asked, her voice low, as if afraid to provoke the shadows. "The voices, they're not just guardians. They're the ones who came before." Thorne didn't want to believe in spirits or curses, but the weight of the blade, the glow of the carvings, the screams in the cavity were too real to dismiss. "What do they want?" he asked, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. "Redemption," she said softly, "or revenge. The heart holds both." Before he could press her further, a shadow detached from the trees ahead, tall and angular, its eyes glinting like the guardians in the cave. Thorne shoved Ayanna behind him, the blade flashing in his hand as he faced the figure. It wasn't Alanetwell more emerged, their forms flickering like smoke, their blades gleaming with that same unnatural sheen. The whispers surged, a deafening roar of voices that seemed to claw at Thorne's mind, dragging up memories he'd buried, his unit's screams, his wife's lifeless eyes, the blood on his hands from 2 years of vengeance. "Stay back," he roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony. The figures didn't speak, didn't hesitate. They moved as one, their blades slicing through the air with a speed that defied human limits. Thorne parried the first strike, the impact jarring his arm, the strange metal singing with a sound like breaking glass. The second figure flanked him, aiming for his ribs, but Ayanna hurled a rock, striking its shoulder. It staggered, its form shimmering as if struggling to hold its shape. Thorne drove his blade into the first figure's chest, the same shimmering dissolution as before, leaving only a blade behind. But the third figure was faster, its weapon grazing his thigh, a line of fire that made him stumble. Ayanna grabbed his arm, pulling him back, her own strength waning but her resolve unbreakable. "The river," she gasped, pointing to a narrow stream cutting through the forest, its water glinting in the moonlight. "It's sacred. They can't cross it." Thorne didn't question her. He half carried, half-dragged her toward the stream, the Guardian's blades whizzing behind them. The water was shallow but swift, its surface cold as it splashed against their legs. Thorne turned, expecting pursuit, but the Guardians stopped at the bank, their eyes burning with a fury that made his blood run cold. The whispers reached a fever pitch, then fell silent, the figures dissolving into the night like smoke on the wind. Ayanna collapsed on the far bank, her breathing ragged, her hand clutching his. "They're bound to the heart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They can't leave its domain." Thorne knelt beside her, his heart pounding, not just from the fight, but from the sight of her fading strength. "We're not out of this yet," he said, scanning the forest behind them. The bounty hunters' voices were closer now, their lanterns casting flickering light through the trees. The Guardians might be bound to the mountain, but the hunters weren't, and they were closing in. He helped Ayanna to her feet, his arm around her waist, and they pushed deeper into the forest. The stream's gurgle fading behind them. The terrain grew steeper, the trees thinning as they climbed toward the high valley. Thorne's thigh burned where the Guardian's blade had cut him, but he ignored it, his focus on Ayanna, on keeping her alive. The whispers were gone, but the weight of the heart lingered, a presence that seemed to watch their every step. Hours passed, the night stretching into a gray dawn that painted the mountains in shades of ash and frost. Ayanna's steps grew slower, her weight heavier against Thorne, but she refused to stop, her pride a flame that burned through her pain. "We're close," she said, her voice hoarse but certain. "The valley, it's just over the ridge." Thorne nodded, his jaw tight. He could see the ridge ahead, a jagged line against the sky. But the forest was no longer their ally. The bounty hunters' voices were clear now, their shouts carrying the confidence of men who knew their prey was weakening. Thorne counted at least 4 fewer than before, but still too many for a straight fight, especially with Ayanna barely able to stand. They reached the ridge as the first light of dawn broke, revealing a wide valley below, its floor dotted with Apache encampments, their fires small but steady against the morning chill. Thorne's heart lifted at the sight, but it was short-lived. A shout from behind snapped his attention back, and he turned to see 4 riders cresting the hill, their horses lathered from the chase, their faces hard with greed and hate. End of the line, Hermit, the leader, a broad man with a scar bisecting his cheek, leveled a rifle at Thorne's chest. "Hand over the Apache, bitch, and maybe we let you walk away." Thorne's hand tightened on the strange blade, his body shielding Ayanna as she leaned against a rock, her breathing shallow but her eyes fierce. "You're not the first to try," he said, his voice calm, deadly. "Ask your friends in the cave how that worked out." The leader's smile was cold, his rifle steady. "You killed Briggs and his boys, I'll give you that. But you're bleeding, and she's half dead. You got no fight left." Thorne's eyes flicked to the other 3 hunters, their weapons drawn, their horses snorting in the cold air. 4 against 1, with Ayanna too weak to help. The odds were grim, but the ghost captain had faced worse. He'd built his legend on worse. "Last chance," the leader said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Step aside, or we take you both." Thorne's smile was a predator's, cold and lethal. "You boys made one mistake," he said, echoing words he'd spoken in the cabin. "You assumed I'd go down easy." Before the leader could fire, a new sound cut through the dawn, a low, rhythmic chant, rising from the valley below. The Apache had seen them. Shadows moved at the edge of the encampment, warriors armed with bows and rifles, their forms blending with the morning mist. The hunters hesitated, their confidence wavering as the chant grew louder, a war cry that promised death to intruders. Thorne seized the moment, lunging forward with the strange blade, its hum rising to a scream as it sliced through the leader's rifle barrel. The metal parted like paper, the shot going wide as the hunter cursed, drawing his pistol. Thorne was already moving, his knife finding the man's chest, dropping him from the saddle in a spray of blood. The other 3 fired, but the Apache chant had unnerved them, their shots wild. Thorne dove for cover, pulling Ayanna behind a boulder as bullets chipped the stone. The warriors reached the ridge, their arrows and rifles cutting through the hunters like a scythe. The fight was over in moments, the remaining bounty hunters dead or fleeing, their horses scattering into the dawn. Thorne stayed low, shielding Ayanna, his heart pounding as the Apache approached, their faces painted with war and grief. One stepped forward, an older man with eyes like Ayana's, his presence commanding despite the lines of age and loss etched into his face. "You are Nalish's daughter," he said, his voice heavy with recognition. "And you are the ghost captain." Thorne tensed, ready for a fight, but Ayana's hand on his arm stopped him. "He saved me, uncle," she said, her voice weak but clear. "He fought for me." The man studied Thorne, his gaze piercing, as if weighing his soul. "The mountains have claimed many lives," he said finally, "but they spared you both. Why?" Thorne met his gaze, the strange blade still in his hand, its hum now silent. "Maybe they're tired of blood," he said. "Or maybe we're not done fighting." The man nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Come, our healer waits." They descended into the valley, the Apache warriors forming a protective circle around them. The encampment was small, a scattering of tents and fires, the faces of its people marked by the same exhaustion Ayana carried. The healer, an old woman with hands like gnarled roots, worked quickly, cleaning and stitching Ayana's wound with a skill that put Thorne's rough bandages to shame. Ayana slept as the healer worked, her face peaceful for the first time since she'd knocked on his door. Thorne sat by the fire, the strange blade across his lap, its weight a reminder of the mountain's mysteries. The Apache elder Ayana's uncle, Sela, joined him, offering a cup of bitter tea that burned going down but warmed his bones. "The heart of the mountain," Sela said, his eyes on the blade. "It chose you. That is no small thing." "Chose me for what?" Thorne asked, his voice rough with fatigue and doubt. "To fight, to die, to live," Sela said. "The heart does not give its gifts lightly. It sees what you carry, your pain, your rage, your redemption." Thorne's jaw tightened. Redemption was a word he'd stopped believing in years ago, when the blood of his enemies couldn't wash away the guilt of his failures. But Ayana's face, even in sleep, was a challenge to that belief. She'd seen him, truly seen him, and hadn't turned away. "What happens now?" he asked, his eyes on the fire. Sela's gaze was distant, as if seeing beyond the flames, beyond the mountains. "The white men will come again. They always do. But you and Ayana, you have changed something. The heart knows it, even if you do not." Thorne didn't respond, his mind heavy with the weight of the past 3 days: the cabin, the cave, the guardians, the hunters, the bond he'd forged with a woman who should have been a stranger. He'd come to these mountains to escape, to bury the ghost captain and live as a shadow. But shadows couldn't fight, couldn't feel, couldn't choose to stand for something greater than themselves. Ayana stirred, her eyes opening, finding his across the fire. She smiled, a small, fierce thing that cut through the darkness in his chest. "You're still here," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Always," he said, the word a promise he hadn't known he could make. The mountains stood silent around them, their peaks sharp against the dawn. The heart's whispers were gone, but its presence lingered, a reminder that some bonds, forged in blood and courage, could never be broken. Thorne and Ayana had found refuge in each other, 2 outcasts who'd defied the world's cruelty to claim something worth fighting for. As the Apache camp stirred, preparing for the battles to come, Thorne realized he was no longer running. The ghost captain had found his redemption, not in solitude, but in the fire of a woman's defiance, in the promise of a fight not yet finished. Together, they would face whatever the mountains or the world threw at them. And God help anyone who stood in their way.